Little House on the Prairie series by Laura Ingalls Wilder. Book 3, Farmer Boy. Chapter 26, Christmas. For a long time, it seemed that Christmas would never come. On Christmas, Uncle Andrew and Aunt Delia, Uncle Wesley and Aunt Lindy, and all the cousins were coming to dinner. It would be the best dinner of the whole year, and a good boy might get something in his stocking. Bad boys found nothing but switches in their stockings on Christmas morning. Almanzo tried to be good for so long that he could hardly stand the strain. But at last it was the day before Christmas, and Alice and Royal and Eliza Jane were home again. The girls were cleaning the whole house, and Mother was baking. Royal could help Father with the threshing, but Almanzo had to help in the house. He remembered the switch and tried to be willing and cheerful. He had to scour the steel knives and forks and polish the silver. He had to wear an apron around his neck. He took the scoring brick and scraped a pile of red dust off it, and then with a wet cloth he rubbed the dust up and down on the knives and forks. The kitchen was full of delicious smells. Newly baked bread was cooling. Frosted cakes and cookies and mince pies and pumpkin pies filled the pantry shelves. Cranberries bubbled on the stove. Mother was making dressing for the goose. Outdoors, the sun was shining on the snow. The icicles twinkled all along the eaves. Far away, sleigh bells faintly jingled, and from the barns came the joyful thud, 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 thud of the flails. But when all the steel knives and forks were done, Almanzo soberly polished the silver. Then he had to run to the attic for sage. He had to run down cellar for apples and upstairs again for onions. He filled the wood box. He hurried in the cold to fetch water from the pump. He thought maybe he was through, then, anyway, for a minute. But no, he had to polish the dining room side of the stove. "Do the parlor side yourself, Eliza Jane," Mother said. "Almanzo might spill the blacking." Almanzo's insides quaked. He knew what would happen if Mother knew about that black splotch hidden on the parlor wall. He didn't want to get a switch in his Christmas stocking, but he would far rather find a switch there than have Father take him to the woodshed. That night everyone was tired, and the house was so clean and neat that nobody dared touch anything. After supper, Mother put the stuffed fat goose and the little pig into the heater's oven to roast slowly all night. Father set the dampers and wound the clock. Almanzo and Royal hung clean socks on the back of a chair, and Alice and Eliza Jane hung stockings on the back of another chair. Then they all took candles and went to bed. It was still dark when Almanzo woke up. He felt excited, and then he remembered that this was Christmas morning. He jerked back the covers and jumped onto something alive that squirmed. It was Royal. He had forgotten that Royal was there, but he scrambled over him, yelling, "Christmas! Christmas! Merry Christmas!" He pulled his trousers over his nightshirt. Royal jumped out of bed and lighted the candle. Almanzo grabbed the candle, and Royal shouted, "Hi, leave that be! Where's my pants?" But Almanzo was already running downstairs. Alice and Eliza Jane were flying from their room, but Almanzo beat them. He saw his sock hanging all lumpy. He set down the candle and grabbed his sock. The first thing he pulled out was a cap, a boughten cap. The plaid cloth was machine woven. So was the lining. Even the sewing was machine sewing, and the earmuffs were buttoned over the top. Almanzo yelled. He had not even hoped for such a cap. He looked at it inside and out. He felt the cloth and the sleek lining. He put the cap on his head. It was a little large because he was growing, so he could wear it a long time. Eliza Jane and Alice were digging into their stockings and squealing, and Royal had a silk muffler. Almanzo thrust his hand into his sock again and pulled out a nickel's worth of horehound candy. He bit off the end of one stick. The outside melted like maple sugar, but the inside was hard and could be sucked for hours. Then he pulled out a new pair of mittens. Mother had knit the wrists and backs in a fancy stitch. He pulled out an orange, and he pulled out a little package of dried figs, and he thought that was all. He thought no boy ever had a better Christmas. But in the toe of the sock there was still something more. It was small and thin and hard. Almanzo couldn't imagine what it was. He pulled it out, and it was a jackknife. It had 4 blades. Almanzo yelled and yelled. He snapped all the blades open, sharp and shining, and he yelled, "Alice, look, look, Royal, looky, looky, my jackknife, looky, my cap." Father's voice came out of the dark bedroom and said, "Look at the clock." They all looked at one another. Then Royal held up the candle, and they looked at the tall clock. Its hands pointed to 3:30. Even Eliza Jane did not know what to do. They had waked up Father and Mother an hour and a half before time to get up. "What time is it?" Father asked. Almanzo looked at Royal. Royal and Almanzo looked at Eliza Jane. Eliza Jane swallowed and opened her mouth. But Alice said, "Merry Christmas, Father. Merry Christmas, Mother. It's 30 minutes to 4, Father." The clock said, "Tick, tock, tick, tock, tick." Then Father chuckled. Royal opened the dampers on the heater, and Eliza Jane stirred up the kitchen fire and put the kettle on. The house was warm and cozy when Father and Mother got up, and they had a whole hour to spare. There was time to enjoy the presents. Alice had a gold locket, and Eliza Jane had a pair of garnet earrings. Mother had knitted new lace collars and black lace mitts for them both. Royal had the silk muffler and a fine leather wallet, but Almanzo thought he had the best presents of all. It was a wonderful Christmas. Then Mother began to hurry, and to hurry everyone else. There were the chores to do, the milk to skim, the new milk to strain and put away, breakfast to eat, vegetables to be peeled, and the whole house must be put in order and everybody dressed up before the company came. The sun rushed up the sky. Mother was everywhere, talking all the time. "Almanzo, wash your ears. Goodness mercy, Royal, don't stand around underfoot. Eliza Jane, remember you're paring those potatoes, not slicing them. And don't leave so many eyes that you can see to jump out of the pot. Count the silver, Alice, and piece it out with the steel knives and forks. The best bleached tablecloths are on the bottom shelf. Mercy on us, look at that clock." Sleigh bells came jingling up the road, and Mother slammed the oven door and ran to change her apron and pin on her brooch. Alice ran downstairs, and Eliza Jane ran upstairs. Both of them told Almanzo to straighten his collar. Father was calling Mother to fold his cravat. Then Uncle Wesley's sleigh stopped with a last clash of bells. Almanzo ran out, whooping, and Father and Mother came behind him, as calm as if they had never hurried in their lives. Frank and Fred and Abner and Mary tumbled out of the sleigh, all bundled up. Before Aunt Lindy had handed Mother the baby, Uncle Andrew's sleigh was coming. The yard was full of boys, and the house filled with hoop skirts. The uncles stamped snow off their boots and unwound their mufflers. Royal and Cousin James drove the sleighs into the buggy house. They unhitched the horses and put them in stalls and rubbed down their snowy legs. Almanzo was wearing his button cap, and he showed the cousins his jackknife. Frank's cap was old now. He had a jackknife, but it had only 3 blades. Then Almanzo showed his cousins Star and Bright and the little bobsled, and he let them scratch Lucy's fat white back with corn cobs. He said they could look at Starlight if they'd be quiet and not scare him. The beautiful colt twitched his tail and came daintily stepping toward them. Then he tossed his head and shied away from Frank's hand thrust through the bars. "You leave him be," Almanzo said. "I bet you don't dast go in there and get on his back," said Frank. "I dast, but I got better sense," Almanzo told him. "I know better than to spoil that fine colt." "How'd it spoil him?" Frank said. "Yeah, you're scared he'd hurt you. You're scared of the little bitty colt." "I am not scared," said Almanzo, "but Father won't let me." "I guess I'd do it if I wanted to, if I was you. I guess your father wouldn't know," Frank said. Almanzo didn't answer, and Frank got up on the bars of the stall. "You get down off there," Almanzo said, and he took hold of Frank's leg. "Don't you scare that colt." "Now I'll scare him if I want to," Frank said, kicking. Almanzo hung on. Starlight was running around and around the stall, and Almanzo wanted to yell for Royal, but he knew that would frighten Starlight even more. He set his teeth and gave a mighty tug, and Frank came tumbling down. All the horses jumped, and Starlight reared and smashed against the manger. "Now I'll lick you for that," Frank said, scrambling up. "You just try to lick me," said Almanzo. Royal came hurrying from the south barn. He took Almanzo and Frank by the shoulders and marched them outdoors. Fred and Abner and John came silently after them, and Almanzo's knees wobbled. He was afraid Royal would tell Father. "Let me catch you boys fooling around those colts again," Royal said, "and I'll tell Father and Uncle Wesley. You'll get the hides thrashed off you." Royal shook Almanzo so hard that he couldn't tell how hard Royal was shaking Frank. Then he knocked their heads together. Almanzo saw stars. "Let that teach you to fight on Christmas Day! For shame!" Royal said. "I only didn't want him to scare Starlight," Almanzo said. "Shut up," said Royal. "Don't be a tattletale. Now you behave yourselves, or you wish you had. Go wash your hands. It's dinner time." They all went into the kitchen and washed their hands. Mother and the aunts and the girl cousins were taking up the Christmas dinner. The dining table had been turned around and pulled out till it was almost as long as the dining room, and every inch of it was loaded with good things to eat. Almanzo bowed his head and shut his eyes tight while Father said the blessing. It was a long blessing because this was Christmas Day. But at last Almanzo could open his eyes. He sat and silently looked at that table. He looked at the crisp, crackling little pig lying on the blue platter with an apple in its mouth. He looked at the fat roast goose, the drumsticks sticking up, and the edges of dressing curling out. The sound of Father's knife sharpening on the whetstone made him even hungrier. He looked at the big bowl of cranberry jelly and at the fluffy mountain of mashed potatoes with melted butter trickling down it. He looked at the heap of mashed turnips and the golden baked squash and the pale fried parsnips. He swallowed hard and tried not to look any more. He couldn't help seeing the fried apples and onions and the candied carrots. He couldn't help gazing at the triangles of pie waiting by his plate, the spicy pumpkin pie, the melting cream pie, the rich, dark mince oozing from between the mince pie's flaky crusts. He squeezed his hands together between his knees. He had to sit silent and wait, but he felt aching and hollow inside. All the grown-ups at the head of the table must be served first. They were passing their plates and talking and heartlessly laughing. The tender pork fell away in slices under Father's carving knife. The white breast of the goose went piece by piece from the bare breastbone. Spoons ate up the clear cranberry jelly and gouged deep into the mashed potatoes and ladled away the brown gravies. Almanzo had to wait to the very last. He was youngest of all, except Abner and the babies, and Abner was company. At last Almanzo's plate was filled. The first taste made a pleasant feeling inside him, and it grew and grew while he ate and ate and ate. He ate till he could eat no more, and he felt very good inside. For a while he slowly nibbled bits from his second piece of fruitcake. Then he put the fruity slice in his pocket and went out to play. Royal and James were choosing sides to play Snow Fort. Royal chose Frank, and James chose Almanzo. When everyone was chosen, they all went to work, rolling snowballs through the deep drifts by the barn. They rolled till the balls were almost as tall as Almanzo, then they rolled them into a wall. They packed snow between them and made a good fort. Then each side made its own little snowballs. They breathed on the snow and squeezed it solid. They made dozens of hard snowballs. When they were ready for the fight, Royal threw a stick in the air and caught it when it came down. James took hold of the stick above Royal's hand, then Royal took hold of it above James' hand, and so on to the end of the stick. James' hand was last, so James' side had the fort. How the snowballs flew! Almanzo ducked and dodged and yelled and threw snowballs as fast as he could, till they were all gone. Royal came charging over the wall with all the enemy after him, and Almanzo rose up and grabbed Frank. Headlong they went into the deep snow outside the wall and rolled over and over, hitting each other as hard as they could. Almanzo's face was covered with snow and his mouth was full of it, but he hung on to Frank and kept hitting at him. Frank got him down, but Almanzo squirmed out from under. Frank's head hit his nose and it began to bleed. Almanzo didn't care. He was on top of Frank, hitting him as hard as he could in the deep snow. He kept saying, "Holler enough! Holler enough!" Frank grunted and squirmed. He rolled half over, and Almanzo got on top of him. He couldn't stay on top of Frank and hit him, so he bore down with all his weight, and he pushed Frank's face deeper and deeper into the snow. And Frank gasped, "Enough!" Almanzo got up on his knees, and he saw Mother in the doorway of the house. She called, "Boys, boys, stop playing now. It's time to come in and warm up." They were warm. They were hot and panting. But Mother and the aunts thought the cousins must get warm before they rode home in the cold. They all went tramping in, covered with snow, and Mother held up her hands and exclaimed, "Mercy on us!" The grown-ups were in the parlor, but the boys had to stay in the dining room so they wouldn't melt on the parlor carpet. They couldn't sit down because the chairs were covered with blankets and lap robes warming by the heater. But they ate apples and drank cider standing around, and Almanzo and Abner went into the pantry and ate bits off the platters. Then uncles and aunts and the girl cousins pulled on their wraps, and they brought the sleeping babies from the bedroom, rolled up in shawls. The sleighs came jingling from the barn, and father and mother helped tuck in the blankets and lap robes over the hoop skirts. Everybody called, "Goodbye, goodbye." The music of the sleigh bells came back for a little while, then it was gone. Christmas was over. Little House on the Prairie series by Laura Ingalls Wilder. Book 3, Farmer Boy. Chapter 27, Wood Hauling. When school opened, as usual, that January, Almanzo did not have to go. He was hauling wood from the timber. In the frosty cold mornings before the sun was up, father hitched the big oxen to the big bobsled, and Almanzo hitched the yearlings to his bobsled. Star and Bright were now too big for the little yoke, and the larger yoke was too heavy for Almanzo to handle alone. Pierre had to help him lift it onto Star's neck, and Luis helped him push Bright under the other end of it. The yearlings had been idle all summer in the pastures, and now they did not like to work. They shook their heads and pulled and backed. It was hard to get the bows in place and put the bow pins in. Almanzo had to be patient and gentle. He petted the yearlings, when sometimes he wanted to hit them, and he fed them carrots and talked to them soothingly. But before he could get them yoked and hitched to his sled, father was already going to the timber plot. Almanzo followed. The yearlings obeyed him when he shouted, "Giddy up!" and they turned to the right or the left when he cracked his whip and shouted, "Gee!" or "Ha!" They trudged along the road, up the hills and down the hills, and Almanzo rode on his bobsled with Pierre and Luis behind him. He was 10 years old now, and he was driving his own oxen on his own sled and going to the timber to haul wood. In the woods, the snow was drifted high against the trees. The lowest branches of pines and cedars were buried in it. There was no road, there were no marks on the snow, but the feather-stitching tracks of birds and the blurry spots where rabbits had hopped. Deep in the still woods, axes were chopping with a ringing sound. Father's big oxen wallowed on, breaking a road, and Almanzo's yearlings struggled behind them. Farther and farther into the woods they went, till they came to the clearing where French Joe and Lazy John were chopping down the trees. The logs lay all around, half buried in snow. Joe and John had sawed them into 15-foot lengths, and some of them were 2 feet through. The huge logs were so heavy that 6 men couldn't lift them, but father had to load them on the bobsled. He stopped the sled beside one of them, and Joe and John came to help him. They had 3 stout poles called skids. They stuck these under the log and let them slant up to the bobsled. Then they took their cant poles. Cant poles have sharp ends with big iron hooks swinging loose under them. John and Joe stood near the ends of the log. They put the sharp ends of their cant poles against it, and when they raised the poles up, the cant hooks bit into the log and rolled it a little. Then father caught hold of the middle of the log with his cant pole and hook, and he held it from rolling back, while John and Joe quickly set their cant hooks, slipped down, and take another bite. They rolled the log a little more, and again father held it, and again they rolled it. They rolled the log little by little up the slant and skids and onto the bobsled. But Almanzo had no cant hooks, and he had to load his sled. He found 3 straight poles to use for skids. When the shorter poles he started to load some of the smallest logs. They were 8 or 9 inches through and about 10 feet long, and they were crooked and hard to handle. Almanzo put Pierre and Luis near the ends of a log, and he stood in the middle, like father. They pushed and pried and lifted and gasped, pushing the logs up the skids. It was hard to do because their poles had no cant hooks and could not take hold of the log. They managed to load 6 logs, then they had to put more logs on top of those, and this made the skids slant upward more steeply. Father's bobsled was loaded already, and Almanzo hurried. He cracked his whip and urged Star and Bright quickly to the nearest log. One end of this log was bigger than the other, so it would not roll evenly. Almanzo put Luis on the smaller end and told him not to roll it too fast. Pierre and Luis rolled the log an inch, then Almanzo stuck his pole under it and held it, while Pierre and Luis rolled it again. They got the log high up on the steep skids. Almanzo was holding it up with all his might. His legs were braced, and his teeth were clenched, and his neck strained, and his eyes felt bulging out, when suddenly the whole log slipped. The pole jerked out of his hands and hit his head. The log was falling on him. He tried to get away, but it smashed him down into the snow. Pierre and Luis screamed and kept screaming. Almanzo couldn't get up. The log was on top of him. Father and John lifted it, and Almanzo crawled out. He managed to get up on his feet. "Hurt, son?" Father asked him. Almanzo was afraid he was going to be sick at his stomach. He managed to say, "No, Father." Father felt his shoulders and arms. Well, well, no bones broken," Father said cheerfully. "Lucky the snow's deep," said John, "or he might have been hurt bad." "Accidents will happen, son," Father said. "Take more care next time. Men must look out for themselves in the timber." Almanzo wanted to lie down. His head hurt, and his stomach hurt, and his right foot hurt dreadfully. But he helped Pierre and Luis straighten the log, and he did not try to hurry this time. They got the log on the sled all right, but not before Father was gone with his load. Almanzo decided not to load any more logs now. He climbed onto the load and cracked his whip and shouted, "Giddy up!" Star and Bright pulled, but the sled did not move. Then Star tried to pull and quit trying. Bright tried and gave up just as Star tried again. They both stopped, discouraged. "Giddy up! Giddy up!" Almanzo kept shouting, cracking his whip. Star tried again, then Bright, then Star. The sled did not move. Star and Bright stood still, puffing out the breath from their noses. Almanzo felt like crying and swearing. He shouted, "Giddy up! Giddy up!" John and Joe stopped sawing, and Joe came over to the sled. "You're loaded too heavy," he said. "You boys go down and walk, and Almanzo, you take your team and gentle them along. You'll make them steers bulky if you don't be careful." Almanzo climbed down. He rubbed the yearlings' throats and scratched around their horns. He lifted the yoke a little and ran his hand under it, then settled it gently in place. All the time he talked to the little steers. Then he stood beside Star and cracked his whip and shouted, "Giddy up!" Star and Bright pulled together, and the sled moved. Almanzo trudged all the way home. Pierre and Luis walked in the smooth tracks behind the runners, but Almanzo had to struggle through the soft, deep snow beside Star. When he reached the woodpile at home, Father said he had done well to get out of the timber. "Next time, son, you'll know better than to put on such a heavy load before the road's broken," Father said. "You spoil a team if you let them seesaw. They get the idea they can't pull the load and they quit trying. After that, they're no good." Almanzo could not eat dinner. He felt sick and his foot ached. Mother thought perhaps he should stop work, but Almanzo would not let a little accident stop him. Still, he was slow. Before he reached the timber, he met Father coming back with a load. He knew that an empty sled must always give the road to a loaded sled, so he cracked his whip and shouted, "Gee!" Star and Bright swerved to the right, and before Almanzo could even yell, they were sinking in the deep snow in the ditch. They did not know how to break road like big oxen. They snorted and floundered and plunged, and the sled was sinking under the snow. The little steers tried to turn around. The twisted yoke was almost choking them. Almanzo struggled in the snow, trying to reach the yearlings' heads. Father turned and watched while he went by. Then he faced forward again and drove on toward home. Almanzo got hold of Star's head and spoke to him gently. Pierre and Luis had hold of Bright, and the yearlings stopped plunging. Only their heads and backs showed above the snow. Almanzo swore, "God ding it!" They had to dig out the steers and the sled. They had no shovel. They had to move all that snow with their hands and feet. There was nothing else they could do. It took them a long time, but they kicked and pawed all the snow away from in front of the sled and the steers. They tramped it hard and smooth in front of the runners. Almanzo straightened the tongue and the chain and the yoke. He had to sit down and rest a minute, but he got up and he petted Star and Bright and spoke to them encouragingly. He took an apple away from Pierre and broke it in two and gave it to the little steers. When they had eaten it, he cracked his whip and cheerfully shouted, "Giddy up!" Pierre and Luis pushed the sled with all their might. The sled started. Almanzo shouted and cracked his whip, and Star and Bright hunched their backs and pulled. Up they went out of the ditch, and up went the sled with a lurch. That was one trouble Almanzo had got out of, all by himself. The road in the woods was fairly well broken now, and this time Almanzo did not put so many logs on the sled. So he rode homeward on the load with Pierre and Luis sitting behind him. Down the long road he saw Father coming, and he said to himself that this time Father must turn out to let him go by. Star and Bright walked briskly, and the sled was sliding easily down the white road. Almanzo's whip cracked loudly in the frosty air. Nearer and nearer came Father's big oxen, and Father riding on the big sled. Now, of course, the big oxen should have made way for Almanzo's load, but perhaps Star and Bright remembered that they had turned out before, or perhaps they knew they must be polite to older, bigger oxen. Nobody expected them to turn out of the road, but suddenly they did. One sled runner dropped into soft snow, and over went the sled and the load and the boys topsy-turvy, pell-mell. Almanzo went sprawling through the air and head first into snow. He wallowed and scrambled and came up. His sled stood on edge. The logs were scattered and upended in the drifts. There was a pile of red-brown legs and sides deep in the snow. Father's big oxen were going calmly by. Pierre and Luis rose out of the snow, swearing in French. Father stopped his oxen and got off his sled.
"Well, well, well, son," he said. "Seems we've met again."
Almanzo and Father looked at the yearlings. Bright lay on Star. Their legs and the chain and their tongue were all mixed up, and the yoke was over Star's ears. The yearlings lay still, too sensible to try to move. Father helped untangle them and get them on their feet. They were not hurt. Father helped set Almanzo's sled on its runners, with his sled skates for skids and Almanzo's sled skates for poles. He loaded the logs again. Then he stood back and said nothing while Almanzo yoked up Star and Bright and petted and encouraged them and made them haul the tilted load along the edge of the ditch and safely onto the road.
"That's the way, son," Father said. "Down again, up again."
He drove on to the timber, and Almanzo drove on to the woodpile at home. All that week and all the next week he went on hauling wood from the timber. He was learning to be a pretty good ox driver and wood hauler. Every day his foot ached a little less, and at last he hardly limped at all. He helped Father haul up a huge pile of logs, ready to be sawed and split and corded in the woodshed. Then one evening Father said they had hauled the year's supply of wood, and Mother said it was high time Almanzo went to school, if he was going to get any schooling that winter. Almanzo said there was threshing to do, and the young calves needed breaking. He asked, "What do I have to go to school for? I can read and write and spell, and I don't want to be a school teacher or a storekeeper."
"You can read and write and spell," Father said slowly. "But can you figure?"
"Yes, Father," Almanzo said. "Yes, I can figure. Some."
"A farmer must know more figuring than that, son. You better go to school."
Almanzo did not say any more. He knew it would be no use. Next morning he took his dinner pail and went to school. This year his seat was farther back in the room, so he had a desk for his books and slate. And he studied hard to learn the whole arithmetic, because the sooner he knew it all, the sooner he would not have to go to school any more.